I have Kim Campbell, who's a master's candidate in public history in the history department. Her paper today is entitled Modern Independent Hospital or Backwards Dependent Asylum, the History of Modernity, Electricity, and Independence at the South Carolina State Hospital for the Insane. Kim.
Thank you, everyone. Before I begin, I'd like to clarify a few terms. First, you'll hear me talk about the new asylum. The building I'm referring to is the Babcock building, but as much of my research focuses on the period while Dr. Babcock was the superintendent, this building was obviously not yet named after him. Likewise, I will use the term the old asylum to refer to the Mills building, as it was not commonly known by the architect's name then. Finally, you'll hear me reference Doom Street, seen here. Doom Street is the name our class uses to refer to what's marked as Mills Drive on your maps and highlighted currently. The name was accidentally coined when Jesse, Maggie, and I were discussing with Dr. Brandt how this area will most likely be razed during any development of the site. And I said something to the effect of, so this whole place is just Doom Street. The name has since stuck and will be the term used throughout. Modern Independent Hospital or Backward Dependent Asylum, the history of modernity, electricity, and independence at the South Carolina State Hospital for the Insane. Many scholars place the decline of large mental hospitals in the 1940s and 50s around the same time explicit comparisons of these institutions and concentration camps came out. This definition not only fails to explain why so much work on infrastructure continued into the 1970s at these institutions, but also assumes that mental hospitals were accepted, or at least ignored, by most Americans until exposés of their inner workings became prevalent. In the case of the South Carolina Lunatic Asylum, later known as the South Carolina State Hospital for the Insane, this thesis is incorrect. Superintendent James W. Babcock and the Board of Regents saw the asylum in danger as early as the 1890s, and they responded to these threats in two ways. First, the Regents made a number of improvements to the asylum's infrastructure in order to provide not only the most modern care to patients, but also all the conveniences of modern life. Secondly, they and Superintendent Babcock sought to isolate the asylum from outside threats by making it a fully functioning independent community. The history of electricity at the asylum demonstrates both of these defensive methods, as does the ice factory and Doom Street more generally. On September 13th, 1893, Dr. James W. Babcock reported to the Board of Regents for the South Carolina Lunatic Asylum, as he did almost every month. However, on this day, Babcock explicitly sought to protect the institution through something as seemingly inconsequential as a name change. Another important question I wish to call to your attention now is whether in retaining the time-honored name of the South Carolina Lunatic Asylum, we are not lagging behind our neighbors. As long ago as 1854, Dr. Kirkbride of Philadelphia called attention to the fact that lunatic was meaningless as applied to mental disease of the mind, and served merely to perpetuate a superstition of a bygone era. In the popular mind, the name asylum now bears with it a stigma. Is it not therefore the duty of your board to adopt the title of Hospital for the Insane, as was done a few years ago by North Carolina, and as has been done by many other states? The duty to protect and modernize the asylum Babcock referred to was not a new idea. Years before Babcock arrived, the board fought for funding to improve the asylum campus. As early as January 1889, the board approved a proposal to wire the old and new asylums, the amusement hall, and the chapel for electric lights. This move put the asylum ahead of much of Columbia in harnessing electricity. The State House had only just begun to install electric lights in 1888, and the process would not be completed there until 1891, fully 2 years after the asylum was running its own power plant in 1889. However, the on-site power plant a single room within the laundry, was only the beginning of the debate surrounding electrifying the campus, as it was neither particularly efficient nor safe. Periodic problems with the wiring in the buildings and the engine that actually ran the plant meant that blackouts were frequent until at least midway through 1892. Additionally, the board resolved in 1891 to cut all electrical operations during storms for fear of fire. This set of circumstances is what Babcock found when he arrived at the asylum. Dr. James Woods Babcock was appointed superintendent of the South Carolina Lunatic Asylum in 1891 by Governor Ben Tillman. However, Babcock was hardly Tillman's first choice. Given the tumultuous political climate in the state capital at the time, many well-qualified candidates for the position were loath to even apply, much less accept, the management of the asylum. Thus Tillman was left with few choices. Although Babcock was originally from South Carolina, he had avoided the political fights occurring in the state since Reconstruction. Despite his specialty in mental disease from Harvard Medical School, many still had their doubts about Babcock's appointment because he had never risen above assistant physician. Babcock himself even wondered if he was up to the task of managing an institution the size of the lunatic asylum, but ultimately, both he and Tillman agreed to the appointment despite their reservations. This is how the young, idealistic doctor found himself the director of an enormous mental institution with the need to fight for both his and the institution's legitimacy on almost a daily basis. Fully aware of both his own and the public's doubts regarding his ability to lead the asylum, Babcock lost no time in instituting a number of much-needed changes. Babcock had worked in more than one northern asylum, and when he arrived at Bull Street, he was incredibly distraught in private with the conditions he found. He sought and gained permission to establish a school for nurses to improve the quality of care patients received, along with planning for a number of improvements to the campus's infrastructure. In the latter endeavor, Babcock found his way blocked by the politics surrounding any state institution. The asylum was chronically underfunded, and Babcock spent much of his tenure asking the regents to request more funding from the legislature. The infrastructure situation was so dire that the engine running the power plant quit working completely mere months after Babcock arrived. The campus ran its lights off gas again until a permanent solution could be found. Between January 1892 and July of the same year, the engine in the power plant was repaired, and the few wards in the new asylum that were wired for electricity returned to using it for lighting purposes. However, in July of 1892, the chief engineer reported to the board that there was a defect of great risk in the wiring, and the insurance inspector felt that the electricity should immediately be turned off due to the great risk of fire this defect presented. Thus began a long fight to bring the wards that already had electric lights up to the code required by the Southeastern Tariff Association, or STA, the company that held the asylum's fire insurance. By November 1892, the power plant was running again, but the STA continued to claim that there were problems with the wiring in the new asylum until well into 1894. Babcock and many of his employees felt this behavior represented an attack upon the asylum, and they told the regents as much on more than one occasion. More significant, though, are the views of the community at large. The Edgefield Advertiser wrote, "The lunatic asylum, and probably some other public buildings in the state, have been the special objects of this rapacious money-sucking trust," referring to the STA. In the 1890s, the local community still viewed the asylum as a beneficent state institution, due in part to the modern improvements Babcock and his colleagues implemented. Early in the state's history, the asylum was not a place most families willingly sent their relatives. With the growing popularity of moral treatment in the antebellum era, asylums offered a cure for insanity and thus were no longer places of last resort. However, By the time Babcock was running the asylum, the gradual decline of moral treatment meant that the asylum was no longer the essentially curative space it had been in the antebellum era. It was becoming clear that the asylum had added a new function. Without officially abandoning its therapeutic mission, it became a receptacle for large numbers of mental defectives of both races who were accepted regardless of curability or ability to pay. Public opinion had again swung away from sending one's relatives here, but the institution was in even more desperate need of paying patients than it ever had been. The all-important gardens and green spaces of moral treatment, along with the various recreations engaged in by patients, attempted to lend asylums of the late 19th century an air not unlike that of health spas. However, these pretty views and games were not enough on their own to encourage families to leave their loved ones. Modern improvements again offered a possible solution. Despite barely having enough money to run the asylum at all, Babcock ensured that every building housing patients on the campus was wired for electric lights before the turn of the 20th century. The white female wards at the north end of the new asylum had been wired before Babcock arrived, but they were fully rewired in 1892 and 93 due to the STA incident. Next, the center main of the new asylum, where the superintendent lived and all the officials of the asylum had their offices, was connected to the power plant. While this seems extremely self-serving, this was the next natural step in wiring the entire new asylum. Additionally, this space contained rooms for patients to visit with their relatives and served as a front for much of the asylum, improving its image with potential paying customers. Before completing the wiring work on the new asylum, the old asylum, which housed African American women, had electric lights. Here, Babcock and his staff made a clear choice that gender was more important than race in determining when and where improvements to the campus would occur. Women, regardless of race, made up the majority of the patient population. In improving the wards for women of both races before those of men, Babcock promoted the asylum's sensitivity toward its most desperate patients, making a good advertisement of chivalry to promote the institution to paying patients, along with the obvious inducement of leaving one's female relative in the most modern setting imaginable. Both the North Building and the Tally Building were electrically lit next, which is unremarkable given that both of these buildings housed white women. By late 1893, the white male wards in the south end of the new asylum had electric lights, in addition to the kitchen located just behind the building. The laundry and bakery located down Doom Street, along with the other support structures, including a repair barn and cow stable not pictured, received power by early 1894. Dick's Cottage, housing the nursing students, and the Taylor Building, which served as overflow housing for white men, were some of the last structures with electric lights in that same year. The Parker Building, housing black men, did have electric lights by the turn of the century. However, it should be noted that as late as March 11, 1897, the Board of Regents voted to provide funds to purchase lanterns of the best quality for these wards. Although asylum officials were willing to overlook the matter of race when providing electric lights to women before men in 1893, they did not prove as willing with funds when it came to African American men in 1897. Although the work to wire the various wards on the campus proceeded with little attention from the Board of Regents, they did not stop discussing electricity. The STA issue arose again and again in the board's discussions, as the wiring of the new asylum and various components of the power plant itself failed to meet the ever-changing standards of the company. In January of 1893, the Regents resolved to fund all necessary repairs on the plant. However, the insurance inspector demanded yet more improvements in September of the same year. This demand came only months before the gas company informed Babcock that they would be taxing meters that did not meet sufficient use requirements, which the asylums no longer did since many buildings were using electric lights. These circumstances caused the board to question whether or not it would be more cost-efficient to outsource power operations, as the power plant was the primary focus of the STA's sanctions by late 1893. Colonel Marshall of the Columbia Electric Lighting Company proposed to provide electricity to the asylum in December 1893. His offer to supply all the electrical needs of the campus for $2,400 a year was rejected by April 1894. The Regent's reluctance to outsource electrical operations appears odd in context. While costs were being cut in every department within the asylum, they continued to fund massive repairs on the campus power plant. The engine that created electricity broke down no less than 5 times in as many years from 1889 to 1894. Finally, the entire dynamo had to be replaced in April 1894, an expense the asylum could hardly afford. What is strange is that the board rejected Colonel Marshall's proposal to supply power for a year for $2,400, when the alternative was to spend that much, if not more, on repairs to their own plant. Despite the poor quality of light the plant produced and its constant need of repair, Babcock and the Regents fought to keep it in operation until early 1896. By that point, Colonel Marshall had dropped his proposal to $2,000 for a year of power, and there was simply no denying that maintaining the plant would cost a great deal more. Cost efficiency was one of the institution's highest priorities at this point, so why would they work so much harder and pay so much more to maintain their poor power plant? Maintaining their own power plant allowed the asylum to be free of the constraints placed upon them by using a power plant controlled by another entity. The fights with the STA over fire insurance code and the gas company over the extra charges on light use meters only confirmed that independence served as protection from outsiders seeking to attack the asylum. However, the board did eventually vote to place the lunatic asylum, which was by then officially the South Carolina State Hospital for the Insane, on the electrical grid of the city. On May 9, 1896, the Columbia Electric Lighting Company turned on the lights within the hospital. This was not the end of the debate, though. For the next 5 years, the board periodically heard proposals from other electric and gas companies offering better rates or higher quality lights, and other proposals from engineers claiming they could bring the power plant up to code cheaply. They even resolved that the board direct the superintendent and the treasurer to cooperate with the chairman on the State Commission on Electric Lighting for the development of electric lighting and power, as well as for heating and other purposes, for the several departments of the hospital, and present the same to the board as early as possible. The Regents decided to terminate the contract with the Columbia Electric Lighting Company after the first year, only to renew it when a fire destroyed the power plant in June 1897. Although extra expense was generally frowned upon, the desire for independence from other entities was strong enough to allow for vigorous debate, even when the quality of the lights provided by the electric company were found far superior to those they could provide themselves. Modernity offered independence, which was an all but explicitly stated goal by the turn of the century, to the hospital in more ways than electricity. A host of support structures grew up along Doom Street starting around 1909. A fire that year had destroyed the laundry facilities, and as a result, new construction on this part of the site was a necessity. In addition to the laundry, Babcock stated a need for a number of other facilities to provide the necessities of the institution on site, thus assuring independence. One such structure is the ice factory. In 1905, Babcock informed the Regents, With the new policy of killing our own beef, it was found necessary to install a cold storage plant. This plant is now the eastern section of the building, known as the ice factory, seen here. By 1909, Babcock was writing on a yearly basis that an ice plant has been an urgent need for years. With the exception of 1911, when Babcock suggested only financing the construction of state park facilities, he requested funds for a refrigerating process plant and ice factory on a regular basis until his tenure ended in March 1914. Although Babcock was gone from the hospital, the quest for independence continued, and in 1916, the ice and refrigerating plant seen today was completed and operational. Although the South Carolina community did not begin to question the hospital until after a 1909 investigation revealed awful conditions, Babcock and the Board of Regents for the institution realized more than a decade earlier that the hospital was in danger of losing its relevance in the community. In addition to large congregate systems of care like the new asylum falling out of favor before the building was even completed in 1885, greater questions of whether or not insanity could be cured at all undercut the essential mission of asylums throughout the country. Asylum physicians were turning away from the therapeutic optimism of the antebellum period. They were coming to believe that a large proportion of the insane suffered from organic and hereditary disorders that would not yield readily to any known therapeutic measures. In this context, Babcock and the board sought to protect the hospital. While we may be tempted to read the story backwards and see the deinstitutionalization of the 20th century as the ultimate failure of these men, we cannot deny that they accomplished something in order to maintain the hospital for almost a century after they saw it under assault. They harnessed modern inventions in an attempt to keep the asylum both attractive and thus useful to the greater community, and free from the interference of as many outside sources as possible. These goals seem paradoxical. However, the improvements afforded by electric lighting and all the structures along Doom Street fulfill them both, and Babcock certainly did not see them as mutually exclusive. His hope was that the institution would stand as a force of good for many years in the community, and while we may debate how much good was done here, we cannot deny that, for today at least, it still stands. Thank you.